Tonight, the crisis in Iraq escalating as armed drones deployed by the military flying over Baghdad. Tonight, we are hearing what two foreign policy experts have to say about the crisis and the potential impact it could have on the U.S. And President Obama sounding off about the congressional gridlock in Washington, saying he's forced to use whatever powers, including executive powers, because Congress won't let him get a thing done. Does the president have a point? Plus, tonight, New York State Senator Jeff Klein speaking to RFL about the Independent Democratic Conference's new alliance with Senate Democrats. Why he changed his tune, and he says it's a necessary move. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we're going to start in Iraq, where the Pentagon officials are saying that U.S. armed drones here, they are flying over Baghdad skies. The Pentagon says the drones, they're to protect U.S. civilians and military force as ISIS militants cast a wave of deadly violence across the country. Now, as you know here, these militants, they have taken over Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. They've also taken control of Fallujah, parts of Ramadi, Baiji, and villages in Iraq's Kirkuk province as well. They have also gained control of towns across the border in Syria, and they've now gotten even refineries, and now even potentially, even possibly, one of the biggest water filtration areas that is responsible for so much within the country. All right. We're going to be talking a lot about this as next week here, there's talk about whether or not Iraq can actually form a new government. Well, earlier today, I spoke to two people with very interesting perspectives on this. We'll hear from New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez in just a minute, as well as our roundtable. But I spoke first to Ariel Ahram. Now, he is an assistant professor of government and international relations at Virginia Tech, author also of The Proxy Warriors, The Rise and Fall of State-Sponsored Militias, about the rise of the very group we're talking about here, ISIS. You know, I think to a lot of the viewing public, they've heard the acronym ISIS or ISIL, and they see that they've made inroads going north and with designs even on the capital city. And they know they're bad guys, even bad guys by Al-Qaeda standards, but they don't know much more than that. If you could, as we take a brief tour of the Middle East here, talk about both their agendas and about how the potential that this has to go well beyond the Iraqi borders, if they haven't already, into places like Syria, obviously, in the greater Middle East.
ISIS originated as a breakaway sect or a breakaway group from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's been in operation in Iraq since 2003. And when the Syrian civil war started in 2011 and 2012, it established a foothold across the border in Syria. So it's definitely operating in Iraq and Syria already. There are strong indications that it has designs on Jordan and possibly even and Lebanon as well. Its agenda is, in some respects, to roll back the partition of the Arab world that happened after World War I and to establish a Sunni-dominated caliphate state that would control all of what we think of as the Levant. That would be Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, as well as Iraq.
And as this plays out, for people who just think of this as a military exercise, right now, forget about what potentially could happen. We already have humanitarian crisis. I mean, you look what's happening with Jordan and the huge amount of refugees pouring across the border, obviously what's happening in Syria and Iraq right now. But even some of the things that have been taken, forget when we look at little dots on the map for cities, talk about, for example, the oil refineries or even that huge dam and what that powers and some of the dominoes that could fall as a consequence.
As I said, ISIS has been around for a while, but most of the territory that it controlled was dispensable, especially if you were sitting in Baghdad or Damascus and concerned about your base at home. The areas that it sat on were desert areas. They were far away. They were not especially economically valuable. They were sparsely populated. Now, with ISIS's advances in Mosul and Tikrit and northern Iraq, and also in Syria, it's now controlling very important sets of infrastructure, oil infrastructure, particularly the Baiji refinery, as well as controlling two of the largest dams in the Middle East, the Tabqa Dam, the Thawra Dam, also known as the Thawra Dam in Syria, and is approaching the Haditha Dam in Iraq. we don't really know what its intentions are with those. I think some of the worst case scenarios have been talking about destroying the dam and creating floods. This is something that ISIS did in Fallujah. They broke open some of the dams to prevent the Iraqi army from approaching Fallujah. But in Syria, it's actually been selling electricity from the hydroelectric plants back to the Syrian government. So it's not entirely a scorched earth campaign, but a very, very sophisticated and strategic maneuver to try and keep itself in business.
I'm curious your perspective. Joe Biden said this 7 years ago.
Not in the lifetime of anyone in this room is there a possibility of a central democratic government in Baghdad, trusted by the factions making up this polyglot country called Iraq. So you must decentralize. You must separate the parties within the context of a limited federal government.
Then presidential candidate Biden said basically, let's just try and split it up in three. Give the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Kurds, they're part of Iraq, have some kind of decentralized government here that everybody can share in the oil spoils, and let's just not kid ourselves. This is the inevitable consequence. 7 years later, was he right?
I don't believe so. I think that we see examples like South Sudan that simply separating countries, simply allowing secessionist movements to work doesn't necessarily solve problems. In fact, it might intensify them. Also, it's important to remember in Iraq that Iraq is more than just three ethno-sectarian communities. It has tribal relationships. It has several other ethnic groups like the Turkmen, all of whom I think want to have a piece of the pie. I think also that other states in the region are not going to be happy to see the breakup of Iraq. They weren't happy about the prospect of breaking up Iraq in 2003, and they're not going to be happy to see it break up today. So I think that what we're likely to see is the emergence of an Iraq that looks, in some respects, like perhaps Georgia or Ukraine look, where you have a central government that has control over specific areas around the capital, but that is out of touch and out of control of large parts of the country that essentially operate independently.
And finally, if you, Professor, were counseling the administration in Washington, what realistically can we do, let alone should we do, in terms of our foreign policy and involvement, whether it be airstrikes or now funding more money to the rebel fighters in Syria? What should the role of the U.S. be here? And maybe we overestimate what our real abilities are. What can and should we do?
I think there is a danger of overestimating what the U.S. can do, but I think that there are certain things that the U.S. should be doing. First is to try and put pressure on the Iraqi government to build a bigger tent and find a way to accommodate some of the more moderate Sunnis who feel like they have nowhere else to go but to make alliances with ISIS. Second is to try and peel these groups away from ISIS directly. The U.S. has had a lot of experience with this in the last 15 years. In the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the U.S. has had direct ties with what they consider to be more accommodating militant groups, and try to find ways to peel them away from the hardcore. ISIS might be the hardcore, but there are a lot of people who are fighting with ISIS who maybe don't subscribe to the strict ideology that they do, but they see ISIS as the winning candidate, and they want to be on the bandwagon. We need to find ways to get them off the bandwagon.
All right, now obviously the crisis in Iraq brings about another complicated foreign policy matter for this president and, for that matter, all of the U.S. Today, I spoke with New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez, who's chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, about the violence in Iraq and how it may affect U.S. interests. You've been consistently against the war in Iraq, but now we find ourselves in a situation where the options range from bad to worse. In the headlines today, you've got the president looking for $500 million to fund the Syrian rebels. You have colleagues of yours in the Senate who are demanding on the president to call for airstrikes. And others are also saying that maybe we should work with Iran or let Iran have a more larger role in at least helping the Shiites in country. What do you think we should or let alone can do with a situation that's unfolding in front of our eyes, as I said, going from bad to worse?
Well, Richard, as you said, I didn't vote for the war in Iraq. I think it was the worst political decision made no weapons of mass destruction, no clear and present danger to the United States, enormous loss of lives and national treasure, and we are now seeing the consequences of that decision by the Bush administration. Having said that, we also face a concern about ISIS, the extremist group that is overtaken parts of northern Iraq, have come from Syria. ISIS is so extreme that even Al-Qaeda said we don't want to have anything to deal with you, so you can just imagine. And they have said as part of their tape recordings and literature that they seek to strike against the United States. So we're going to have to think about ISIS, this extremist group, as it relates to our own national security, not just simply about Iraq. And we will have to act accordingly. And my own view is that if, in fact, we can have enough intelligence and satellite imagery that would give us high-value targets that could ultimately significantly hurt ISIS so that they don't have the wherewithal to attack us in the United States, we should consider that. We certainly should ultimately take out their passings from the Syrian to Iraqi borders and eliminate that so they can be divided up from their presence in Syria to the rest of Iraq. And we should be helping the Jordanians, for which they're at their border as well. This is a critical ally of the United States. Having said that, we can never replace through air power the necessity of the Iraqi government to come together as a government, Iraqi Shia, Iraqi Sunni, Iraqi Kurds, as one people, one nation, fighting for a country. And if they can't do that, then we can never replace that national will. And so that's something that we don't see. That's something I think Prime Minister Maliki is incapable of doing. I hope that they will, as they are assembling a new government after their elections, I hope they'll change the Prime Minister, who will be someone who can bring all those three groups together. If not, we'll just have to look at ISIS from the lens of how do we protect our own national security interests.